mailin@harvard.edu. Now the error has gone away. I can click register. And even though nothing useful happens, again, the URL changed, indicating that I did submit the form, just to know where useful. All right, so that's all fine and good. But it turns out that email is one of the relatively few types of fields that you can check for in addition to search and text more generally and a few others as well. But it turns out that browsers nowadays, in the context of HTML, support what are called regular expressions to help solve this problem. A regular expression is a pattern, otherwise known as a regex for short, that allows you to validate input from users and make sure that that input matches some pattern. And this is a bit of a mouthful how you can do these. There's a whole bunch of documentation online, not only at this URL, but in Python's own documentation and in other locations as well. But just wanted to give you a taste of the possibilities because these are really everywhere in high-level programming nowadays, as well as in this context of HTML. Here is the symbology of regular expressions. We're not in a language. It's just a way of representing patterns, if you will. If you have a dot in a string of text that's a regular expression, that just means any character. It's like a wild card. Any one character can be there. A star actually means 0 or more times. So you can say, give me a character 0 or more times. So there's either nothing there, or there's 1, or there's 2, or there's more. You can use a plus, which means give me 1 or more characters. So not 0, but 1 or more. You can use a question mark, which means 0 or 1 character, but that's it. You can use curly braces, unrelated to Python, and say, I want this many occurrences of a character. And you can have a range inside of curly braces. Give me minimally this many characters, maximally this one. And you can do other things too. In square brackets, you can say, give me any one of these digits, 0 through 9 in this case, but you could type anything in there that you want. You could say 0-9 to specify a whole range without having to type them all out. You can type \D to indicate any digit, so you don't have to type any of that out. Or you can do the opposite, \D, which means anything except a digit. So long story short, and I'm very much waving my hands at some of the details here, there's this whole symbology that humans have come up with in different languages via which you can represent patterns. So this is all to say that I could come up with my own pattern for an email address, even though it's not going to be as good as the browser's own. Let me go back to VS Code here. Instead of saying type equals email, let me go back to type equals text, or heck, I can go to the default and get rid of this altogether. But I'm going to use one other attribute we haven't yet seen, which is literally pattern equals quote unquote. Inside of this pattern's value, I can use a regular expression, a pattern that represents what kinds of values I want to accept. Now I'm going to keep this simple and therefore not very good, but remember that dot means any character. Plus means 1 or more of any character. An @ means literally an @. Another dot means any character. Another plus means 1 or more of any character. Then \edu. What's going on here? Well, we haven't seen this yet, but curiously, if I want to literally have a period in the user's input, well, I can't use dot because that means any character. It was a wild card. So just like in C, just like in Python, I have to escape certain characters. So in regular expressions, if I do \dot, that means give me a literal dot in the user's input, an actual period. And then edu means make sure that the user's email address, in this case, ends with .edu. Now this is a bit of a simplification because it is not the case in email addresses that you can allow for any 1 or more characters, then an @, and then any 1 or more characters, and then a .edu. It's actually more formally defined than that. So this is a very quick and dirty regular expression for an email address. However, if I now go back to my register page and reload, and I again try to type in David and not an invalid email address, that pattern will be checked and the browser will prevent the form from submitting at all. So I can express different patterns of things. Now, for email, that's not the best thing because, in fact, if I actually look at the official definition of an email address's regular expression, according to browsers, it's actually this crazy long sequence of text using the symbols I showed you as well as some others. But this just speaks to how complicated the definition of an email address's pattern is. So using type equals quote unquote email, definitely the better bet. But let me do something a little more reasonable. If I go back to VS Code here, and let's suppose that we want to ask the user not for an email address, but their phone number. So let me change the placeholder to be phone, for instance, and then let me change the pattern to be that of a US phone number. So here I could do this in a bunch of ways, but I'm going to use \d, which means any digit, and then curly braces 3 times. Then a hyphen, then a \d, curly braces 3, then a hyphen, then \d, curly braces 4. And this here represents a standard format for a US-based phone number, 3 digits, dash 3 digits, dash 4 digits. So this is how I can now ensure that the human types in not an email address, and definitely not their name, but a phone number that at least follows a certain pattern. Maybe not very user-friendly, because do you really want to require the user to type in dashes? Wouldn't it be nice if they can skip those? Maybe they want to use parentheses. So there's better ways, arguably, still to do this. The point here, though, is that web pages and other programming languages more broadly do support these things called regular expressions, which are wonderfully useful in the real world. But there is a danger here. Suppose that even though this catches invalid phone numbers now, register, it's telling me to match the requested format. Unfortunately, as great as all these features are, these patterns are that I just introduced, you as web developers now should never trust users' input. Why? The only thing stopping the user from typing in invalid data, like their name instead of their email, or their name instead of a phone number, or something else invalid, is the code that they've downloaded to their browser. But recall that even though when they view page source, they see exactly what came from your website, they can open their own browser's developer tools via inspect here. They can go to those elements and, for instance, expand the form by clicking this triangle. And if they don't like the pattern you're imposing on them, well, let me just go ahead in there, delete that, hit enter. OK, watch what happens now. I have modified the in-memory version of the web page. I can click register now all I want. And I have just submitted DAVID instead of a phone number. So this is to say, unfortunately, that this week alone, we do not yet have enough skills, enough knowledge to correctly validate user input. We can make the experience more user-friendly. We can tell them right away in the browser, you're doing something wrong. Please don't submit this form yet. But we're also going to need, before long, a server-side mechanism for defending against that kind of attack too. So through phishing, and in this case through modification of the actual DOM in memory, we've seen all too readily how adversaries can try to infiltrate our sites in some way. Now, in addition to the developer tools that come with your own browser, it's worth noting that there is at least one official source via which you can validate your actual HTML. That is to say, make sure that it is well-formed and that it actually adheres to the HTML spec. At validator.w3.org is a web-based tool that you can use to copy-paste your HTML, even paste the URLs of web pages into. And this is actually a tool that will provide you with some feedback as to whether or not you've made syntactic errors with your actual code. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll introduce stylization of these pages, namely through CSS. All right, we are back, and it's time now to start stylizing these web pages so that they're not just these boring black and white pages that have structure to them, but really no style. And so for this, what we're going to do is introduce another language called CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, which is another language, but not a programming language, via which you can specify how certain tags should be appearing on the screen. For instance, we've already seen tags like H1, H2, H3, and I described those as big and bold, and not quite as big and bold, and not quite as big and bold. But what do we mean by bold and big? It would be nice if we could actually use font sizes or pixel sizes. It would be nice if we could introduce colors and other aesthetics. And indeed, CSS allows you to adorn the structure of your page with the last mile of detail, so to speak. The colors, the sizing, the spacing, the positioning, and so much more. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need to introduce one other term of art, namely properties. And frankly, at this point, we're just coming up with different words for the same ideas in all of these various languages. But properties are sets of, not surprisingly, key value pairs. A property allows you to specify the color of something is this value, or the margin for this something is this value, or the height of something is this value. So properties is just the term of art used in the CSS world to describe key value pairs, just like attributes is the word used in the world of HTML to describe their key value pairs. Same idea for as far back as the dictionaries with which we introduced this here topic. Now, where can you go about using properties and how can you go about using them? Well, it turns out there's going to be different ways of applying properties to elements inside of a web page. And you're going to have to specify as the developer how to select those there elements. And with the wave of a hand, let me describe there as being type selectors, class selectors, ID selectors, and attribute selectors, some of which we will see over time. And all this means is that we're going to use slightly different syntax when we want to refer to different parts of a web page. To do that, though, we're going to need to tell the browser that we want to include some CSS in our page. So here again is that sample HTML that represents really the simplest canonical web page that we can create. This one's just saying hello title and hello body. And if we make room in the head now, it turns out that there can be more than just a title inside of the head of a web page. In particular, you can have a tag called style, which is wonderfully named because inside of that tag, you can put some of those CSS properties, key value pairs, targeting specific elements inside of a web page. Alternatively, we're going to see that instead of using a style tag, you can actually use another tag up here, namely a link tag, which unfortunately is poorly named insofar as it doesn't refer to a hyperlink in the way that the anchor tag and the href attribute does that we described earlier. This one allows you to link in the contents of a .css file, which contains all of those same properties, the key value pairs, but instead of typing them out in your actual web page, you can actually put them in a separate file and include them more readily. But it turns out there's yet another way to stylize web pages, and that's with style attributes. And we'll begin our story there, if only because it's the simplest way to begin. But then, as we often do, we'll try to improve the design thereof. So let me go back to VS Code here. Let me create a new file called home.html and pretend like we're creating a home page for someone, like John Harvard here on campus. Let me go ahead and save a few keystrokes, as often, by copying and pasting my hello world code into home.html. I'll change the title of the page, I'll get rid of hello body, and I'll hide my terminal window so we can now build a home page for John Harvard. Let me imagine this home page as having like three big sections, like a sort of header for the page with John's name, maybe a middle of the page that just welcomes people to his web page, and then a footer with like copyright information or things like that. Pretty common format for a web page, sort of something up here, something down here, something down here. We just need a generic structure with which to play with some HTML and then some CSS. So let me do this. Let me create a paragraph tag at the top of the page that just has John Harvard's name. Let me create a second paragraph below that that says, welcome to my home page, exclamation point. And then below that, let me have a footer of sorts that's just copyright John Harvard in this way. Now, let's go about improving this in a few ways. Well, one, this is a very quick and dirty copyright symbol. It turns out, as an aside, that there's other ways to express characters in HTML, one of which is through what are called HTML entities. Because it turns out, for some symbols that aren't easily typed on your keyboard, you can actually use some special syntax. And I'm going to use this, ampersand, pound symbol, 169, semicolon. And here, VS Code is actually highlighting it, colorizing it so I can see what's going on differently. This is an HTML entity using code number 169, which if you look it up in a book or a manual online, you'll see that this means an actual copyright symbol. So a little C with a circle around it. So useful and commonly used here in the US. Not as easy to type on the keyboard. You could alternatively go Google it, highlight, copy it elsewhere, and paste it in using Unicode. But HTML entities are commonly used still to represent certain symbols like these. Now, let's look at what this web page resembles. Let me go back to VS Code in my directory index. Let me click on home.html. And here we have John Harvard's web page. But notice that there are indeed 3 paragraphs of text, although it's not really appropriate to call these paragraphs because they're really just different parts of the page or divisions of the page. So we'll come back to that. But all of the font sizes are the same. Like there's no making John Harvard big and bold here. I don't really need to see the copyright as big as it is. So you might want to start stylizing content like this. But we have, with HTML alone, structured this web page. So how can I add some style? Well, first I'm going to introduce a style attribute before then taking it away. I'm going to go to my paragraphs start tag here. I'm going to add a style attribute, and I'm going to change, for instance, the font size here. So font-size, large, semicolon, close quotes. Then on this tag here, I'm going to add another style attribute equals quote unquote font dash size medium semicolon close quotes. And then lastly, just to keep this going, style equals quote unquote font size colon small semicolon close quote. Now, strictly speaking, I don't need the semicolons in this particular case. I'm doing it just for uniformity, as we'll soon see. But they're kind of back, just as they were kind of back when we introduced SQL and the end of those statements. But here now, I seem to have added some attributes, the style attribute, to each of these tags that's stylizing the aesthetics of this here page. So the structure is the same, but now the aesthetics are different. In fact, let me go back to my other tab. Let me reload the page, and I should see now these new styles. And indeed, it's a little subtle, but the top line is bigger, the middle line is medium, and the bottom line is indeed smaller. Well, it'd be nice to kind of center everything. So what else can we do with this page? Well, let me go back to VS Code here, and let me, after the semicolon, do something like this. Text dash align colon center semicolon. And just to save some time, let me go ahead and highlight everything I just added and paste it inside of those same quotes. So now notice I have more properties. And indeed, that's what we're looking at here. This key, font size, has a value of large. The whole thing, therefore, is a property. And I've used it in 3 different ways with 3 different values, large, medium, and small. This is another property over here, text align, whose value is center. And I'm using that again and again and again, separating them both, again, by semicolons. Let me go back to my page here. And you might imagine, as soon as I click reload, now everything is nicely centered. So I'm taking some baby steps toward improving the aesthetics of this page, but I dare say I haven't really done this in the best way. Let's chip away at this further. So paragraph tags are fine, but semantically they're really meant to describe paragraphs. And I'm hard pressed to say that John Harvard is a paragraph and copyright is a paragraph. But these are different regions of or areas of my page. So I think what I'd like to do here is just be semantically a little more appropriate. So I'm going to change my p tag to be a little more generically div tags, which stands for division, which is kind of a generic rectangular region of the page, which in some sense is adding less information, but we're going to improve upon this further. This is a very common way to structure pages. In fact, when we glimpsed Harvard's HTML earlier, there were lots of divs in the page because someone who designed that page was kind of laying things out in rectangular regions. And even though there's no visible rectangles, that's kind of what's going on here. It's one rectangular region on top of another. 3 of them in total. But I don't think this is the best design still. Why? Well, let me go back to VS Code here. And even if you're brand new to CSS, let alone HTML as well, you might have noticed that I kind of copied and pasted, and that generally has not been a good practice. It suggests that I'm just doing something redundantly. But what if I did this? What if I factored out that redundancy, that commonality, the text align center as follows? Let me go ahead and delete it here. Let me delete it here. And let me delete it here. And let me propose that all 3 of these divs actually have a common parent from which they descend, so to speak, namely the body tag. So technically, I could go up here and do a style attribute on the body tag equals quote unquote, and then put text align colon center semicolon. And the idea of, again, the document object model with CSS is that that text alignment, centering it, will cascade down to the child elements, which are div, 3 of them in this case, so that all of them are still centered. Let me go back to my other tab here and reload, and even though nothing has changed visually, underneath the hood, I have factored out that commonality and applied text align center to all 3 of those same elements. Now, technically, there's other ways to do this. If I didn't want to stylize the whole body, especially if this is a bigger page that has other elements inside of it, I could actually introduce a parent of my own. It is perfectly reasonable to create a parent div, which after all is just sort of a generic container there. Let me close it all the way at the bottom here and indent it accordingly. And then let me go ahead and indent all of these 3 divs inside of that new div to make the point that if I don't want to apply a style to an entire body of the page, that's fine. I can similarly just do text align center right here, and that too would achieve the same result. And indeed, in Harvard's page, we might have noticed there were lots of divs, not only side by side, but nested inside of each other. Perhaps, it would seem, for similar reasons as well. Now, strictly speaking, I don't have to do it this way. Let me go back to the body approach just to keep it simple. But let me propose that as useful as these divs are, as these containers, whereby each of them describes a different region of the page, I could probably help the internet. I could help search engines. I could help AI. I could help screen readers, for accessibility's sake, understand a bit more about what I mean for each of these divisions of the page to be. So instead of just generically saying div, what I'm actually going to do instead is use 3 semantic tags. And by semantic tags, I just mean HTML tags that are not as generic as div or paragraph, or P for short. I'm going to specify that John Harvard is actually in the header of this page, and I'm going to close that tag accordingly. That welcome to my homepage is in the main part of the page, and I'm going to close that accordingly. And the footer is actually in a tag called footer itself, and I'll close that one as well. Now, these are not tags I'm just making up. These are officially in the HTML specification, but they mean exactly what they say. The header for the page is probably useful. It's kind of informational, where you are, whose web page this is. But the main part of the page is generally the juicy part that has actual information that isn't just logos and headings like that. The footer, though, typically tends to be less important. It's got useful stuff, but it's probably not as important as the header and or the main part of the page. So these tags capture those semantics. And the upside is when Google or Bing show you sample search results, or when ChatGPT or some future technology is learning about what this page is saying, it could logically give a little more weight to the header and the main part and less weight to the footer. So you don't see excerpts from the footer, which might not generally be nearly as useful. But what else can we do now that we've introduced these tags? Let's actually take a step toward improving the design of this page too. Generally speaking, it's not the best practice to combine the structure of your page with the aesthetics thereof. In other words, it's not the best idea to combine HTML with CSS all in the same place. Because when I glance at this page, it would be nice if my HTML really did just structure the page. And then somewhere else, maybe in a different file altogether, all of the aesthetics are. Why? Because this way, maybe, I could use different CSS properties for night mode, for dark mode, and for light mode, so that depending on the time of day, the colors of the website might be a little bit different. I could maybe use different style sheets for different devices or different types of browsers or the like. So it'd be nice to kind of factor out the stylization from the web page itself. That said, this is sort of a swinging pendulum in industry. There are technologies that actually do combine CSS with HTML, the argument being that the closer they are, the easier it is to maintain the code and understand what is affecting what. So you'll find arguments in both directions when it comes to the separation of HTML and CSS. But let's take a step towards separating them, at least for our desktop and laptop-based purposes here. Let me do this. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these style attributes, which is unfortunately going to ruin the aesthetics of the site and make it very generic as before. However, I'm going to reintroduce those properties in a different place. As I proposed earlier, we can make room in the head for not just the title, but a proper style tag. So not an attribute, but a tag. And inside of that style element, what I'm going to put is a few different properties. But the way I'm going to do this is by selecting parts of the web page that I want these properties to apply to. So when I said earlier there's these different selectors in the world of CSS, this is a fancy way of saying there's different syntax you can use to apply automatically certain properties to certain tags or certain types of tags. So let me go back to VS Code here. And what I'm going to do inside of my style element is this. I'm going to specify that any tag called body, which happens to be one and only one, should have all of its text align in the center, semicolon. Unfortunately, curly braces are back when using CSS in this way, not unlike C. But again, we're not programming. We're really just defining key value pairs. Any tag called header, I want to have some slightly different properties. Font, size, colon, large. Any tag that's called main, I want to have font, size, colon, medium. And then any tag that's called footer, I want to have font, size, colon, small. Now, even though this is taking up way more lines of code, it is a step toward keeping my styles separate from the content of the page. And eventually, if you are on the same page as me here, where this might be leading, we can probably copy and paste all of those styles into a separate file. Then two people can work on the same website at once. One person can do structure, one person can do style. We can do the whole light mode, dark mode thing by having different files for different times of day. Feels like a design opportunity. And all we've done, though, is select tags by way of their names here in this particular case. If I again go back to my other tab and reload the page, it's actually not going to look any different, but underneath the hood, it's indeed been structured and styled slightly differently. And here's where we have an opportunity to actually reintroduce those developer tools for yet another reason. Let me right-click or control-click on the page. Let me click Inspect. And as before, you can see all of your HTML at left under Elements. But notice at right, all this time, even though I didn't mention it before, you can also see styles for things as well. So for instance, if I click on the body, watch what happens at right. I will then see a summary from my browser of all of the CSS properties that are being applied to the body of the page. One of them is apparently text-align center. And then there's two others, even though I didn't type these out, display : block, margin : 8 pixels. And that's the user agent style sheet. Long story short, there are certain default properties that browsers have, be it Chrome or Edge or Safari or Firefox or the like. And what I'm seeing in italics there for the body are some of the default stylizations. And this is why, therefore, some browsers will render the exact same HTML slightly differently unless you try to standardize it somehow with your own CSS. But what's nice about Chrome's developer tools and any of these browsers is here too. Instead of going back and forth between VS Code and my browser tab and reloading each time I want to see a change, I can change things in real time, not permanently, but in the browser's memory. So if I'm just curious and I want to see what this text would look like when aligned to the left, I can type in left and notice it immediately jumps there. If I delete that altogether, notice that Chrome actually shows me a drop-down menu a la autocomplete of all of the possible valid values for the CSS property. So it's a great learning technique too. I don't have to constantly look things up or watch a video online. I can let the browser tell me what are the possible values if I'm learning or I just forget what I can possibly type there. I can go ahead and undo that, go back to having things centered, but I can actually play around a bit further here. Suppose I want to change the font sizes. Well, let me go down to header here and notice what we meant was font size large for header. Well, honestly, reasonable people are going to disagree what small, medium, and large mean, certainly across Google and Microsoft and Apple and other companies. So what does large actually mean? Well, I could be more specific. If I really want this to mean something, I can say something like 18 point. Which with you might be familiar in the desktop publishing world. I can change this to maybe 24 point to make it even bigger. Or I can even deal in pixels. I can say something like 36px for pixels. And I can get really crazy, like 360. And you see that now it doesn't even fit on the screen. But look how nice it looks because it's being dynamically sized. So I can just kind of play around with these various styles in the inspector itself. So in short, within Google's developer tools, and again, almost every browser has this nowadays, the network tab showed us the underlying HTTP stuff. The elements tab shows us the underlying HTML. And now the styles tab shows us the underlying CSS. And there's so much more, but so wonderfully useful when trying to modify or learn this here stuff. Let me go back now to VS Code, and let me propose to introduce another way of selecting elements. Previously, I mentioned there was this whole list, and what we've just done is select things by way of their type. The type of the tag was body, or header, or main, or footer. But there's these things called classes in CSS2. It's not really the same thing as classes in Python or Java or other languages if you're familiar. But classes in CSS are our own keywords that we can invent and associate our own properties with those keywords. So for instance, if I wanted to reuse styles like text-align center and font size large and font size medium and small, I don't have to associate them with specific tags. I can create my own nicknames for these, if you will. Let me say that anytime I want to center something, no matter what tag it is, I'm going to use a class called centered. Anytime I want to make something large, I'm going to use a class called large. Anytime medium, I'm going to make a class called medium. And anytime small, I'm going to make a class called small. Now, why the dots? The humans who invented CSS needed to come up with some way to distinguish the types of tags or the names of tags from classes. And so you simply use a dot to indicate, hey, browser, here comes a class whose name I'm making up on my own. So anything with a dot represents the start of a class name. How do I use these? Well, let me scroll down to the bottom of the page. And now there's no association yet with any of those class names with this HTML. But what I can introduce now is a class attribute where I can specify, OK, I want John Harvard to be large. And I want the main part of my page to be medium. And I want the footer of my page to be small. And by the way, I want all of this to be centered. So you can create these reusable words, and you can invent the words subject to a few constraints on what characters you can use, but now you have a set of classes, so to speak, that you can use on these tags and maybe bunches of others. They're not that useful at the moment because this web page is so darn simplistic, but you could certainly imagine in Harvard's web page and Yale's web page and Google's web page, where they have so many darn tags, might be very useful to use these classes and reuse them so you don't have to copy and paste any of that text as we saw before. And in fact, let's take this one step further. It's a little silly that I keep scrolling up and down. Let's just move all of this CSS to its own file. So let me highlight that and cut it. Let me get rid of my style tags altogether. Let me create from my terminal window a file called styles.css, though I could call it anything I want. Let me paste those lines in there. And VS Code nicely left aligned everything for me. That's it, out of sight, out of mind. Let me close that file. And then inside of the head of this page, instead of a style tag, let me do in link href equals styles.css. And the rel tag for the relationship here is that of style sheet. It's generally the only one you'll use, and this is the kind of thing you might have to look up or copy paste, but href refers to the file that you want to link in, essentially copy paste, but automatically, like an include in C or an import in Python. And the relationship of that file to this one is that of what's called a style sheet, a sheet or page of properties. So let's now perhaps use these techniques to make things that are a little prettier now and a little more visually interesting. Let me go ahead and do this. Let me close out this home page here. Let me go ahead and open up our old file called link.html, which previously looked like this when we left it at Yale. Let's actually undo that phishing attack and change it back to harvard.edu for consistency with before. And let's try to bring this link to life in a slightly different, more colorful way. If I open this page, recall, we did see the link. If I close my developer tools, go back to link.html, notice it was underlined by default, which was great because it made very visually clear that it is a link and not just text. And it was purple, which is the default color in most browsers to indicate, yes, it's a link, but it's one you've already visited. So purple means you've visited it before, and blue typically means it's a link, but you have not visited it before. So that's a default, but suppose I want to override that and make things more crimson or red in nature. Well, let me go back to VS Code here. And in VS Code, let me go ahead and, just for the sake of discussion, let me take one step backward just because it's easier and more efficient during class to reintroduce our style tag. But if you're convinced you could and probably should move this stuff to a separate file, that's indeed the best practice. But I'm going to keep it simple in the same file. Let's go ahead and start to stylize this anchor tag as follows. My anchor tag, abbreviated A, is going to have the following property associated with it. A color of, how about red, semicolon. And now let me go back to the tag here, reload the page, and indeed, it's now red and underlined here. If you want to get rid of the underlying, you can. I could additionally, inside of these curly braces, say text decoration, which is another property we haven't yet seen, whose value is now going to be none. If I go back to my browser tab, reload the page, it's still red, but not underlined. And that's fine, and that's pretty common nowadays. But here, too, for accessibility's sake, you should be mindful of the fact that depending on the quality of someone's vision, they might not be able to distinguish red from black or red from some other color. So in terms of accessibility, you should make sure that if you're removing telltale signs of links like underlines, make sure there's sufficient contrast between the colors that you're indeed using. So in fact, let me go ahead and leave that alone for now. But let me propose that I'd like to at least show when a user on a laptop or desktop hovers over the link, let me at least underline it then. This is less useful on mobile because on mobile you don't really hover as much as you do tap or not tap. But just so you've seen how in CSS this is done, I can do this too. I can have a selector that says A:hover, which is a special keyword that the browser knows about, which means when I'm hovering over with my cursor an anchor tag, change the text decoration temporarily to actually being underlined. And if I go back to my browser tab, reload, notice that I get now some interactive behavior. Anytime I hover, you can see the line appearing. For better or for worse, this is how you can implement a bit more dynamism then with your here content. And the fact that it's an anchor tag means that it's going to apply to any of the anchors, any of the links in this here page. If I don't want that to be the case, let me propose this. Let me propose that instead of doing this, I want to define some properties as follows. Let's go ahead and undo this. And in this page, let's suppose that we have a visit to Harvard or a visit to href equals https://www.yale.edu, close bracket, Yale. So the page is a little longer now, but the sentence now reads visit Harvard or Yale with two different links. How can I now stylize these a bit differently? Well, let me go ahead and do this. Inside of my style attribute, let me specify that I want the Harvard link to be red. How do I do that? I'm actually not sure I can just yet, but what if I do this? If I know I want to stylize this tag, let me actually give it a unique identifier. There's different ways to do this, but perhaps the most deliberate would be give this anchor tag a unique identifier called Harvard or whatever you might want to call it. And let's do the same over here. Let's add an ID to the second anchor tag that calls this tag Yale. And I'm using lowercase by convention. What this allows me to use is yet another type of CSS selector. Not type or name, not class, but ID. I can create a unique identifier that allows me to say, target the Harvard element. How do I express that? Well, instead of using a dot, I actually use a hash symbol here, and I say hash Harvard, and then inside of those curly braces, I can say color red. And I can do hash Yale, and then inside of those curly braces, I can say color blue. And actually, just to bring back memories, for better or for worse, of hexadecimal notation and Photoshop, as we discussed when we discussed multimedia and representation thereof, I can actually use hexadecimal codes. So instead of saying red or blue or any other color, I could say hash symbol here, unrelated to the hash symbol next to the class name. Now we are combining color codes with CSS. I can do this, FF0000, which is a lot of red, no green, no blue. Down here I can say hash symbol, no red, no green, lots of blue. And those represent essentially the same colors. Down here I still want to do I'm going to not bother actually with the text decoration anymore. Let me go back to my page here. Let me reload. And now it's getting a little prettier, a red Harvard, a blue Yale, with those two links targeted specifically. Now there's yet other ways too. A third way would be to target a element based on the value or presence of one of its attributes, aka an attribute selector. But I'll wave my hand at that, since surely you'll see eventually in documentation elsewhere, if you go down this road with web design, how you might target those as well. But we don't have to do even these selectors. IDs are meant to be unique. So maybe it would be better to say anytime I have something related to Harvard, let's use a class called Harvard. Anytime I have something Yale related, let's use a class called Yale. So here then, instead of saying ID, I can say class equals Harvard and class equals Yale. And now, even though it's not relevant for this simple example, I can use that class on a different elements again and again. An ID is meant to be unique, and it is a mistake on your part or my part if you use it in multiple places. All right, so much like with HTML, which really only had tags and attributes as its basics, similarly is CSS relatively simple in design with just these properties. And it too has a much larger vocabulary of things and features that you can use throughout your web page, but we'll wave our hand at that so that you pick up that vocabulary over time via online references or the like. But for now, let's just focus on how you can really leverage CSS to take up a notch the aesthetics of your page and make things much prettier than I myself have been doing thus far. Let me go back to VS Code and let me copy from the code I brought with me today a phone book example that gives us the simple form of a phone book with 3 people. Let me go ahead and open this file as it's already been made. And in this file here, after I close my terminal window, is this: a phone book that is apparently made up of an HTML table. Inside of that table is a couple new tags that I'm introducing for formality's sake here. One is calledthead for table head, inside of which is the heading of the table with a table row, tr, with 2 th tags, table heading for short. Long story short, even though the table I made earlier to mock up the visual of a phone keypad is perfectly correct structurally, it turns out if you want to distinguish the header of your HTML table from the rest of your HTML table, you can do so by introducing thead up here and tbody down here. So implicitly, what I was doing earlier was treating everything as the table body with no fancy header up top. But what is different here is that by using th for the table heading here, instead of TD, it's a clue to the browser that this actually has some semantic meaning. This is the heading of the table, and maybe it, for instance, should be bold-faced by default. But we've seen already we can start to override that. As for the body of this table, it seems like it's a phone book with 3 people, Yulia, David, and John, with our now familiar numbers, each implemented in a table row. If I go back over to my directory index and reload, I'll now see phonebook.html. And even though the data's there, honestly, it's not particularly pretty, if you will. In other words, within this file here, I've got all of the data I care about, but certainly no CSS. And while I could go in and start using some selectors and adding some CSS, some key value pairs for properties to make this prettier, maybe with some borders and the like, I bet I can do better by standing on the shoulders of someone else who's made a third-party library, who's thought about what would be the prettiest way to display an HTML table. And this gives us an opportunity to discuss what are called frameworks in the world of web development in particular. A framework is really a library written by some third party that just makes it easier to frame your own project, to sort of structure your own project so that you don't have to implement a lot of basics, particularly aesthetic, that so many other people have had to deal with as well. Better to focus on the problem you actually care about, the business you're building, the product you're creating, rather than worry too much about the aesthetics thereof. And among the more popular frameworks in the world of HTML and CSS is something called Bootstrap, which is a library that anyone can use and incorporate into their websites, really by just including one or more HTML tags, and suddenly everything would seem to look prettier. And in fact, let me go ahead and do this. Let me copy an example I brought with me as well. This one, a second phone book example.